Hello, I hope you can see the presentation here. Yes, thanks Daniele for the introduction. Yes, today I present the methodology that the JRC we use in order to build patent indicator for clean energy innovation policy. I start saying that we all know that patents protect inventions that are new, that concern technology development, and may have industrial application. So patent indicates the novelty. They have a potential for, they indicate potential for commercial exploitation, and they may simply indicate market strategy, since patents can only protect invention from imitation. And we also need to know, and here I quote Bosberg in 1987, that only some inventions are patented, and a small part of this invention may become innovations, and some will be patented. So this is important to know that patent data that we analyze will, of course, contain some innovation, but they also may contain inventions that have no commercial value. So in order to understand, it is critically important to understand the patenting process and what data are available and when, in order to build the indicators for policy. So I'll give an example on how the patenting process works and what data are available. So for example, let's take an invention produced by a German firm that that produce different patent applications in different countries in order to protect the invention in these markets. Each patent application is filed at a certain date, and all of these applications gain the same earliest date, which is the date of the first filing among these applications. Of course, we are aware of the content of this application only when these applications are published, and they come at a different time. And also, we can analyze this data only when these are available. And for example, here in this example, we see that the full picture of this invention will be available only in the spring version of PASTA 2020, which is the main data sources that we use. So considering all these rich information sets, we can analyze the trend in the clean energy sector. So for example, when we analyze how many patent applications are published each year, we have a metric on how much new knowledge is introduced each year. Sorry. When we analyze the number of applications filed each year, we have a measure of the effort to protect inventions, since we know that each application comes at a certain cost. And when we analyze invention, so avoiding the double counting the same patent application that protect the same invention, we are analyzing the inventive activity. Of course, these three indicators comes with a different time lag, as we've seen before, because of the patenting process and the data viability. At the JRC, we analyze the inventive activity, also because this, as was just said before, this gives an important insight to estimate private R&D, which is another line of research in our portfolio. So to summarize our patent-based methodology, consider patent family as a proxy of invention. We do consider all the applications filed in all patent offices without any filters. And we know where the invention has been produced, so the earliest date in which these are filed. We also know the owner, the applicant of this invention, and we also know what are the technology addressed by this invention. So then we apply the fractional count, which consists on assign an equal share to all the combination of this information in the family, so we are able to assess the inventive. Together with this measure, we also introduce the the concept of high-value inventions, which are those inventions that are protected in more than one country. And we also introduced the concept of international fraction of the invention, which is the part of the invention protected in a country different from the country of the applicant. This methodology has been applied for several years now, and it has become a reference within the European Commission. We also provide the support and data in order to keep consistency, methodological consistency in our policy messages. For example, we collaborate with Renomics, and we will hear about their patent analysis in the next presentation, in the following presentation on Clean Energy Innovation Index. And we have also collaborated with IRENA in analyzing patent trends. And we are happy to see that the recent report published by the IEA and the EPO follow a similar methodological steps on what I've just presented. This increase the validity of this methodology in the community, and it's important to keep consistency on the message that we deliver to policymakers. So what we can do with these methodologies to analyze the green inventive activity, and by this I mean all the climate change mitigation technologies. We know that the MI countries highly contribute to this activity, particularly China, Japan, Korea, US, and Germany, that are the top 5 MI countries. And we know that the 24% of this inventive activity is of high value, and then 40% of this activity is international, meaning that, and for example, Japan, here we see that is the country that mostly protect the invention internationally, and China is the country that attracts the highest number of foreign inventions. Thanks to the methodology, we can also analyze and visualize the network of collaboration in the inventive activity, and we see here that there is a very dense network, dense collaboration among MI country and beyond. And we see also some clusters in Asia and Europe, mostly because of geographical proximity among countries. But we also see that country in South America and Africa should be somehow more involved in developing green technology in order to increase capability and also diffusion of green technologies. And I'll conclude by showing this slide in which I present the share of green inventions in the total total inventive activities, despite technology area. What we see is that after 2012, there is a drop in the share of green inventions in these activities. And to explain what has happened, I show here the annual growth of green and not green invention, and we see that after 2012, the not green invention grew more than the green invention. I think this is an important lesson to learn, since we are living again in a crisis, and we should push as much as possible green invention in the post-COVID crisis in order to take the opportunity to reshape the technology sector. And so to conclude, I summarize that it's absolutely important to understand the patenting process and the patent data in order to build indicators for policy. And similarly, it's important to understand the limitation of patent data. Overall, we saw that there is a dynamic and growing clean energy sector where every country highly contributes to this, and where China mostly protects inventions domestically, while Japan, US, Korea, and Germany play a more international game, let's say. And that there is a need to accelerate the green transition in the post-COVID crisis, mostly by greening the inventive activity, and where possible increasing collaboration also to developing and underdeveloped countries to increase technology transfer and diffusion of green technologies. And yeah, I thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, please ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. You already have a couple of questions in the chat. So the second presenter is Jan Menier from the European Patent Office. Jan will present on patents and the energy transition. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So thank you for the opportunity to participate in that event. And the presentation I will make is focused on a study we recently produced with the International Energy Agency on patents and energy transition, which was actually released last week. And the study is focused on a global technology trend in the field of low carbon technology. And the first point I would like to mention concerning this study is that it's based almost entirely on EPO's YO2, YO4S scheme dedicated to green technologies that was already mentioned in the previous presentation. So
sorry to interrupt, Jan. Can you please switch your in display settings because we are seeing the presenter mode view.
Oh, okay.
On display settings, you should have an option to switch from presenter, yeah, on up above the slide.
Sorry, display settings, yes.
Swap presenter view.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
it's better.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, and sorry for that. So yes, I was saying that the study is almost entirely based on the EPO's YO2 scheme. I guess most of you in the group are familiar with it, are users of that scheme, so I will not elaborate much on it. I just need to mention that it's a scheme dedicated to green technologies. It's based on the expertise of EPO examiners. So we have 4,000 examiners highly specialized at the EPO. So they are the ones producing the preparations behind the tagging. It's part of the cooperative patent classification, meaning that there is a commitment to maintain it over time. And it's distributed for free with our PatStat database and other EPO patent information product. And it's really meant to enable further research and exploitation of this data by academics, by policymakers. A few more words on the design of that scheme. So it's meant to be both comprehensive and granular. There are 5 main sections and 372 classes within these sections. And as a matter of fact, it has become a kind of standard, including for the structure. Most research reuses the data of the YO2, but also the structure of the YO2. And this is the main, an important point of interest for us, because we are interested in understanding technological change. We are interested in monitoring, and so this structure may change, or the direction of technical change may evolve. And this is why, on top of maintaining the scheme, we are interested in partnering with experts, such as the International Energy Agency, to monitor this technological change. And this is what we do in the present study, with a broad focus on energy technologies related to low carbon, which encompass most of the sections of the YO2 as shown in this slide. So I obviously don't have the time to cover all the studies, so let me focus on some key insights from it. And let me start with this chart. Those among you who use the YO2 may recognize the pattern. It was already said also by the previous speaker. So here you have the trend in dark blue, the trend of international patent families in low carbon energy from 2000 to 2019. And we can clearly see 2 periods. There was a very fast growth of patenting in this field from 2000 to 2012-13. actually at an average growth of 12.5% per year. That's very fast, much faster than all other technologies, which are in light gray on the chart, base 100. And but this has stopped around 2013. There was a dip, and then the growth resumed from 2016 to 19 in our data, but at a much slower rate. So it's still a significant average year growth rate of plus 3.3%, but much slower than before. And that's a bit worrying given the challenge of the technologies that are to develop in that field. So that's the bad side of the dark side of this result. The interesting and more positive part of the result is that in the recent years, we observe a growth of innovation in low carbon energy, while at the same time we observe a decrease of innovation in fossil fuel supply technologies, which you have in light blue on the chart during 4 consecutive years. And in the study, we have a chart showing the trend for fossil fuel since World War II. And it's the first time since World War II that we have 4 consecutive years of decline of innovation in fossil fuel technology. So that suggests possibly a new regime, a shift. So our main interest in the study is to understand the technology drivers underneath this trend at the aggregate level. And for that purpose, we worked with the IEA to reshuffle, to reorganize the data from the YO2, and we came up with 3 main categories, which are represented on this chart. So in light blue, you have the first category, which we call low carbon energy supply. So anything that is related to the generation of low carbon energy, such as renewables, nuclear, or more efficient combustion. Then we have more the demand side, so the end user technology, so anything that is related to energy efficiency or fuel switching in the end use sectors, a wide range of end use sectors, of course. And finally, there is an intermediate category, cross-cutting enabling technologies that make it possible to better integrate renewable in the grid, for instance, but also to deeply transform the end use sectors. And these include batteries, smart grids, hydrogen, and carbon capture, use, and storage. And if you split the trends according to these 3 categories, it sheds some interesting light on what has been happening in the past 20 years. You see that the fast growth from 2000 to 2012 was mainly driven by supply and end use. And on the supply side, it was mainly renewable and especially solar PV. And clearly, this has come to an end, and now we have a decreasing trend there, which reflects largely the maturity of the sector reached by the sector of solar PV and wind. The other main driver of the growth between 2000 and 2012 was innovation in end-use sectors, and this has stopped in 2013, and now we have a plateau. And in fact, behind this plateau, you have a diversity of situations depending on the industries. I will come back to that. And in fact, the real driver of the growth of patenting in low carbon energy in the recent years is found in enabling technology, so batteries, smart grids, hydrogen. This is what is growing, and this is what seems to be the frontier now of green innovation, of green energy innovation, with strong spillover effect on both the supply and demand side. So just to illustrate that point, let me highlight the case of the automotive industry. So the study, we zoom on various sectors or technologies, and we show in particular that in the sector of road transportation, there has been a shift of the direction of R&D investment from traditional efficiency in classical fuel engine vehicles to the electric vehicles, and as soon as 2011. And so we have a change in the direction of technical change here, which is really systemic, which represent a lot of innovation, and which has strong spillover effects on the other sectors, especially through progress in cross-cutting enabling technologies such as batteries or smart grids for the charging infrastructure. So this is typically the type of insights that we are looking for at the EPO. We want to document what is happening at the sector level. And we think there is potential for further exploiting the data from the YO2, and more generally the expertise of our examiners to do that. And the best way to do it is to do that with experts. So we are very happy to work with the IEA on that. We are planning more studies of this type. And likewise, we are partnering with IRENA for the monitoring of emerging technologies in the field related to renewables, such as electrolyzers or offshore wind. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jan. Our third speaker is Francisco Boschel from the International Renewable Energy Agency, which will present on where is renewable energy innovation heading and what patents data can tell us. Francesco, you are the speaker now. I think you're mute.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. And I hope you can also see my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Daniele, and thank you also to Mission Innovation for this invitation to participate in this important workshop. So, concerning the use of patent data to be used by policymakers and other stakeholders in the field of renewables, the first thing we focused on in IRENA was to actually facilitate the access to renewables patent data. And for that, we developed an interactive online tool called Inspire, which is publicly available and is based also on collaboration with the European Patent Office using their PatStat database and the YO2 classification as well. And you can see the link there. And with this interactive tool, users can quickly search and visualize patent trends via a friendly dashboard or set of dashboards. And with this toolbox, with this interactive tool, policymakers can already do some initial analysis on these trends without having to wait for reports from organizations like ours to be published, but already have some good initial insights on these data from patent data. Now, okay, in IRENA, we also, of course, use this data for our own analysis. And if we look, for example, at the cumulative number of patent files for renewable energy technologies, we can see that, for example, in the last decade, the quantity of renewable generation technology patents filed has more than tripled. And between 2001 and 2017, the compound annual growth rate for renewable energy patents has been more than 16%, which is quite high in comparison to other industry sectors. You can also see that the main technologies with activity in patent filing for renewables are, first of all, solar by far, even more than half of all patents filed, followed by wind energy technologies and bioenergy. We also use this data to create maps where we can compare, for example, the leading countries in patent filing versus the leading countries in deployment for specific renewable technologies or products. 2 years ago, for example, we published an article on biofuels comparing these two aspects. Interesting, for example, that of course many of the countries who are leading in patent filing also are leaders in deployment of liquid biofuels. There are some exceptions. For example, Japan, Korea, and Australia. They are leading in patent filing for biofuels, but they really don't have a big local market for liquid biofuels. So it seems to be that they are more focused on exporting technology than local production of the product. On the other hand, we see, for example, Thailand and Indonesia, where they have we are leading in deployment of liquid biofuels, but they don't have such a big activity in patent filing for this technology. So really focus on importing technology, but producing that for the final product. And of course, we have been listening to the other speakers. We also look into the annual patent filing data, with its ups and downs. And here is what actually it starts to get more interesting, because as policymakers, organizations like ours, we would like to understand the drivers behind these changes. And here we can see in the case of renewable generation technologies, as mentioned by the previous speakers, we peak in 2011, then followed by a decline, and then currently a new peak close to 2016. But as I said, the question is, why is this happening? So the causation question, which is very tricky. And we can look into many different aspects. Patent filing changes due to, for example, advancements in technology maturity. So more mature the technology gets, less patents you have. Of course, R&D investments. If you invest less in R&D, you can expect less patents. Global, regional, and local policies, economic crisis, etc. But of course, there is no one clear answer, and usually this is a multi-factors effect, but it's very difficult to single out one specific cause. In the case of renewables, we could, for example, look into carbon markets, so the externalities. And what we see is that in 2001, the first global carbon market, the CDM, was operationalized with the Marrakesh Accord, followed in 2005 by the start of the EU ETS, which really created the first big demand for carbon credits. So you could expect that from then, you could see an increase or a push for innovation in renewables, so an uptrend. Then in 2009, with the COP in Copenhagen, that was seen as a failure for climate change negotiations and carbon markets, we may expect a decline in interest in invention in these technologies. And then we had in 2015, the Paris Agreement, again, seen by many as a success for climate change and carbon markets. And then you could say, okay, from now on, we see more real engagement in mitigating climate change. So we may see an increased interest in inventing or innovating in renewable energy technologies, and then an upward trend. But of course, this kind of analysis needs to be supported by more factors. But this is the kind, I think, of ideal case we would like to see as policymakers. So to better understand what instruments actually are having an impact on incentivizing innovation. Concerning the maturity aspect, in the renewable electricity sector, we could say that as renewable technologies are becoming very competitive and widely deployed, now we should focus more the innovation in integrating renewables. So it means enabling technologies. And actually, that's what we see, that in the case of enabling technologies, there is an increasing trend also, especially looking at electromobility, as mentioned by Jan, but also batteries, fuel cells, smart grids, and green hydrogen. And despite we also see this peak in 2012, the decline is not so steep, and also the curve is more flattened for enabling technologies than for generation technologies. And if we look into one of these enabling technologies, green hydrogen produced via electrolysis, there is really no decline in patent filing from 2012, but we see it's a steady increasing trend that continues till 2017. Now, to continue to expand the understanding on how to use this data, we are conducting two complementary projects funded by the UK, the one that you see on the right side of the screen, looking into all different indicators that may support mission innovation countries and beyond to monitor the progress of innovation in renewables. And the project, and the other project funded by the European Commission on the left side is a deep dive into three indicators, mainly cost data, but complemented also by patent data and international standards data. And we are testing our methodology also with a set of technologies, starting with offshore wind. And for the patent analysis, we are closely collaborating with the JRC. We are using their data to ensure consistency in our respective analysis. And to give you an idea of what we are finding with this project, we see that, for example, for offshore wind, we see that despite most of the deployment of offshore wind is in Europe, actually China and Korea are the leading countries in patent filing for foundations for offshore wind technologies, turbines. We also see that Korea actually is the country with the highest share of offshore wind patents compared to all wind patents in general. So they are more specialized in offshore wind than other countries. But if we see at the patents that are considered of high value, then here we see again Europe taking the lead, where we have Germany, France, Spain, Denmark in the top 5. And all MI countries, mission innovation countries, are also very active in general. We use patent data, we facilitate the access to patent data, we use it in articles, etc. But we also use patent data in all our technology analysis, all our innovation outlooks, and also we have a close cooperation with the World Intellectual Property Organizations, where we use that, for example, for the Global Innovation Index, which was focused on energy 2 years ago. And we continue to expand these activities with the European Commission and the support of the UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. Our last presenter in this first part of the panel is Onne Hognen from Trinomics, which will present on innovation trends from the perspective of patents. Onne, the stage is yours. I think you're mute. I believe you're still.
Yeah, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Mission Innovation, for the opportunity. My name is Onne Hoogland, and I will be presenting on our work that we did for DGRTD, for the European Commission, on innovation performance from the perspective of patents. Within the study, we aim to develop a composite indicator to track clean energy innovation performance. This composite indicator includes multiple dimensions, including patents, but also indicators on publications and on trades. Later this year, the first work will be published. Today, I will be talking about the patents work, and the objective of this was to identify patent indicators with relevance for measuring innovation performance, to provide insight on clean energy technology innovation performance from the perspective of patents, and to propose a selection of patent indicators that are most suitable for measuring innovation performance, and as a result, for including in the overall indicator. Today, I will highlight a few key trends and developments, also looking at how the performance of countries shifts depending on the indicator you use and how that changed over time. Yeah, I will do that through a series of graphs. The scope of the work that we did is global, with a focus on mission innovation countries. The thematic scope is on clean energy technologies. Most of them will be clear from the name: renewable power, energy efficiency, e-mobility, renewable fuels. There's also a category on resilience and security of the energy system. This includes technologies related to transmission, distribution, storage. There's a category on CCUS and on nuclear. Today I will focus on two indicators: patents, the overall patent numbers, and international patents, only patent applications that are filed abroad. Our work is based on the work that Francesco presented earlier, the JRC methodology. So we also, when I refer to patents, I actually refer to inventions or patent families. But for simplicity, I will just mention patents. The overall picture, like some of the other speakers already showed, quite a steep growth up to 2012. More modest growth, or a more stable picture from 2012 onwards. If we look at the overall growth in patent numbers, we see that China in particular is responsible for the growth, with very impressive growth over the whole time period considered, also in the more recent years. For the other countries, we see that the applications grew up to 2012, but after that the numbers declined or remained stable. If we change the perspective a bit and we divide the number of patents by the GDP as a measure of the size of the economy and the size of the resources that the country would be able to mobilize for innovation, then we get a different picture. Then we see China still showing strong growth, but in particular Japan and Korea show exceptionally high performance if you look at patents per unit of GDP. So this changes the picture quite a bit. If we then transition to international patents, so patents that are filed abroad, and we exclude all the domestic applications, then the picture changes again. So this is not scaled by GDP anymore. Here we only look at the absolute number of international patents. And we see that Japan is doing very well, is responsible for most of the applications, followed by Korea, the United States. Here we also see that it's much more equally distributed. So the group of other mission innovation countries that are not mentioned specifically are also responsible for a large number of patents, of the international patents. If we scale this graph by GDP, then again Japan and Korea are the top performers in terms of international patents per unit of GDP. What was explicit already a bit in the previous graphs, and it's more explicitly shown in this graph, is that there are very large differences in the strategies applied by the different countries. So the Chinese patents are mostly only filed domestically, which could be the result of the large domestic markets. So for Chinese companies active in renewables, there's of course less of an incentive to file the patent abroad because the home market is already so large. It could be because of the lack of the less international orientation of those companies. But it's very interesting to see the big contrast, in particular with the United States, for instance, where almost 40% of the patent applications are filed internationally. If you look at the distribution across the different categories of technologies, then we see that energy efficiency is responsible for most of the patent applications. This includes industrial energy efficiency, but also in buildings. And you see this fluctuates between 45 and 50% of the applications. Renewable power and heat, as some of the earlier speakers already mentioned, it grew up to 2012, renewables, but after that it has declined by quite a bit. E-mobility has a relatively stable share over the time period. And renewable fuels, the share of renewable fuels decreased quite a bit in the first few years, probably because of a lesser focus on biofuels. In this graph, we don't see the growth in hydrogen translating into a significant growth of renewable fuels yet, but that may come if you look at the graphs shared by Francesco before me. If we then move on to the last slide, here we see that for the different sectors, the strategies differ too. So some sectors are more internationally oriented, e-mobility, for instance, renewable fuels, CCUS, whereas other sectors like nuclear and technologies related to the resilience and security of the energy system are more domestically focused. To conclude, we see strong growth in clean energy patents up to 2012. From 2012, a more mixed picture. There are large regional differences in patent strategy. In particular, the Chinese approach is quite a bit different from the other countries. Most activity for energy efficiency, for renewables, for e-mobility. And both patent indicators, the total patent applications and the international patent applications, they provide valuable insights, and we will include both of them in addition to the high value patents that some speakers refer to in the composite index that we will develop further over the rest of the year. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Onne. I think we have done a very good job in answering questions through the chat, but there is one pending question for Francesco Pasimeni, is from Georg Zachman, whether there is a technology or country bias in these time lags.
Yes, indeed, I was ready to reply. Actually, we constantly see this kind of time lag in all technology sectors. And so we came to the conclusion, and as I showed the second slide, it's mostly related to the patenting process, the time lag, and also depend on what we analyze, if we count patent application published or filed. And for the other question, yes, we replied thanks to Aliki. And yes, so the green technologies refer to climate change mitigation technologies, and the fractional count, so we assign an equal share to all the inventions that we find in the database.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. I don't see any other pending question unless the participant has sent directly to the presenter. So we're now going to have a 5-minute break, and we will reconvene exactly in 5 minutes from now. So we will get an extra 3 minutes for the roundtable, which I believe is going to be as interesting as the first part of the panel. Thank you, and see you in 5 minutes. Welcome back. I will now give the floor to Professor David Popp from Syracuse University, who will give a scene-setting presentation before the roundtable on using patent data to track clean energy innovation. David, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you. Go ahead. All right, let me go ahead and get everything up here. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the theoretical concepts for using patents to track clean energy innovation. So our goal is to measure progress towards a technology goal. Right? As we can think first, why are patents useful for doing this? Right, so they provide a detailed record of each invention. This is particularly important in the private sector because private sector R&D data are limited. They're available across for long time periods across many countries. And citations, as was discussed earlier today, indicate knowledge flows as well. Right? To interpret them correctly, we want to think about what it is that we're trying to measure, what we can observe, and what we can't observe. Right? So really what we care about are the expected benefits of new knowledge, right? So trying to lower the cost of green energy. Right? So I put in blue, we really think there's this idea of some additions to some knowledge stock, right? What it is that we know about a particular invention, right? But this is something that we don't observe. Right? So instead, we can observe inputs to the invention process, so R&D expenditures, and we can observe outputs, as we've discussed. Patents are an example of that. Scientific publications would be another example of the outputs. Okay. So suppose, for example, we want to know how policy influences progress towards a technology goal. Okay, so we're imagining that we have some R&D subsidy or some policy like cap and trade or renewable portfolio standard, and we expect this is going to increase innovation. R&D data, though, are likely to be incomplete, particularly if we're thinking about innovation in the private sector, right? So we might know, at best, we might know the total spending that a firm does, but we're not going to know how much General Electric's R&D spending goes to wind turbines versus airline engines versus appliances and so on. Right? Patent data allow us a much more detailed proxy of that. But what we're doing then, we're tracing out this path here. The policy leads to R&D, which leads to new knowledge, which leads to some outputs. But these outputs are affected by some noise in the process, right? There's other influences, right? So IP policy varies across country. Whether firms are willing to patent an invention, right? So one thing we haven't talked about, there are other ways to protect an invention besides patenting, right? So secrecy might be important, and that often varies by technology, right? In the pharmaceutical industry, patents are very important, right? In other industries, they may be less so. Right? The key points of this are that patents are an imperfect proxy for the new knowledge gained, right? They depend on the value of patenting in a given sector, and they depend on differences in patent laws across countries. Because of that, we want to be careful. We're better off focusing on time series, looking at trends within countries or within technologies. And we need to be more careful making comparisons across countries or across technologies. So, example of this, so we've seen figures like this throughout the presentation today. So the yellow here are inventions in solar, the blue in wind. These are patents registered in 2 or more countries with inventors from the United States, the European Union, or Japan. And so we see the patent that we've talked about all day here with the idea that there was this big increase in patenting up to about the financial crisis, and then invention in wind and solar start to decrease. And that's pretty reliable across all these countries. If we look at the levels, so a couple of things you'll see more patents for Japan, particularly in solar, than we do for the other countries. That may be an indicator that Japan is a leader in this technology. But one thing we need to be careful about is that patenting behavior does vary across technologies. So historically, patents in Japan have tended to be smaller in the sense that they have fewer claims per patent. than patents in the United States and the European Union. What we would be more comfortable saying is that if we look at Japan, there's clearly, a relative advantage in solar over wind, right? We don't see that big spike in wind patenting in Japan. Similarly, in the European Union, right, we see, wind, more innovation in wind rather than solar, right? In the sense that any differences in patent laws would affect both technologies, presumably the same way. We can be more comfortable saying Japan seems to relatively specialize in solar, European maybe a bit in wind. That's probably more reliable than saying one country is the leading producer of a technology. Another thing to keep in mind is that it's difficult to identify the effect of a single patent. Actually, again, we really want to think about this idea here. What are the expected benefits of new knowledge, right? How does knowledge actually lower costs or so on? The challenge here, again, since we don't measure knowledge, right? The way we're going to measure this, right, is through this feedback, right? That knowledge leads to outputs, patents, publications. We can look at how patents then affect energy cost or whatever our output measure is. But to borrow from Dr. Who, like, knowledge is a big ball of wibbly wobbly stuff, right? So a smartphone has thousands of patents embodied in it. And there's no way we can say that one patent is more important than the other, or we can't take one out and expect the smartphone to still work in the same way. Knowledge is just a kind of agglomeration of stuff. And there's, again, unobserved influences here, right? So some patents are going to be more successful than others. Maybe patents have very little commercial value, some have very high commercial value. So at best, really what we can do is we can kind of get the average effect of the patents that have been created in a field. So to give a couple examples, I'm going to use some examples from my own work. So one way that we can work with patents to figure out the effects on technology is, instead of trying to identify the effect of a single patent, use what I call knowledge stocks. Right, so that's these patents, the accumulated patents, to proxy the additions to knowledge that improve technology. Right, so much in the same way that we can accumulate firm investment to get to get measures of the investment in physical capital infrastructure, we could do the same thing with patent data. So a paper that I published in Energy Economics, we use stocks like this to look at the extent that new knowledge created between 1990 and 2004 increased the deployment of renewable energy. So we had data on countries, both developed and developing countries around the world, looked at where patents were filed. During this time, the knowledge stock for wind energy, for example, tripled, which led to nearly doubling of wind investment relative to what would have occurred if there hadn't been these technology improvements. So knowledge did have an important role. We do find that paper, though, that direct policy support was more important than just the creation of new knowledge. We can also use patent citations to help track flows of knowledge both over time and across institutions. So patents include two types of references. So there are references to other patent documents, and there are also references to scientific publications, conference papers, white papers, and so on. And both of these can be useful. So as an example of this work, a paper on Nature Energy, I look at how long it takes until public energy R&D, right? So the investments made by government have an impact on technology, at least measured through new patents. Okay. A couple of things that we see here. So one, the first step is we link the R&D spending to research outcomes. And so we find that $1 million in additional government R&D leads to 1 to 2 new additional publications, but there's long time lags, right? So we see publications coming out a year or two after funding, but it can take as long as 10 years between the initial funding until publications finally start to level off. The second step is we use those citations to on patents to early publications to link articles and patents. And then we estimate what's the probability of new funding leading to a citation on a patent. And we find that this probability peaks 10 to 12 years after funding. So this is the annual probability of increased probability of a citation to the non-patent literature on a patent after $1 million of R&D funding. And this is the cumulative probability. So you'll see that it might be really 5, 6, 7 years when we first start to see the probability going up, and levels up somewhere about 10 to 14 years after that funding. So it can take a long time until the impacts of those public R&D investments are realized. Finally, and work related to this in 2017, you ask what institutions provide the most impactful research, and do collaborations matter? Right? So this can help governments decide, where do we want to target research investments? One thing I show in this work is research that is produced by government institutions. So this is not research that's funded by the governments, but carried out in government laboratories. Particularly helpful moving alternative energy research to an applied stage. So for example, government articles are not more likely to be cited by other articles, but government publications are much more likely to be cited by other patents, right? Suggesting they're kind of moving research from the laboratory into practice. We also find that collaborative research enhances knowledge flows across institutions. Patents with collaborations are 31% more likely to be cited than university patents, which are always our baseline in this. And the collaborations are also more likely to cite other types of science, other types of article. I want to add here that both of these results exclude self-citation. So it's not that the two collaborators are citing each other, or I suggest that these collaborations are helping expose each side, so you have a university and a laboratory working together, helping to expose each side to different types of knowledge. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We are now moving to the roundtable, which is going to be moderated by Jenny Dodson, the head of the Mission Innovation Secretariat. Jenny, you are back on stage.
Very much, Daniele. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Fantastic. So, I mean, I've just been blown away by the presentations we've had so far. I think they've been really fascinating, and I've learned a lot about some of the evidence that's out there, and how we can use patents to understand some of the landscape. So I'm really delighted we've got this roundtable discussion now to explore some of the issues that have come up, and get a few further insights and reflections on how this type of evidence can be really valuable. As I've said before, I think Mission Innovation is really keen to understand how patent analysis can inform more efficient and effective research development and innovation policies in the clean energy sector, what data and analytical gaps should be addressed in general terms and could be addressed by Mission Innovation, and what kind of international collaborations could be instrumental in filling analytical gaps. So I'm delighted that we've got Francisco Boschel, who is Renewable Energy Markets and Standards Analyst at the International Renewable Energy Agency, Nick Johnston, Chief Statistician at the International Energy Agency, Sangeeta Kasturi, who is Senior Scientist at the Department of Biotechnology at the Ministry of Science and Technology of the Government of India, David Popp, who you've just heard, Professor of Public Administration and International Affairs at Syracuse University in the US, and Vangelis Tisvis, I really apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, who's Deputy Head of Knowledge for the Energy Union at the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. So hopefully those people are all online and can perhaps put their videos on so everybody can see them. So yeah, first of all, I'd just like to ask each of you in turn to perhaps give a quick reflection on what you've heard so far today from the presentations, and whether there's perhaps a particularly interesting point that you heard that really sparked your interest, or perhaps was something you hadn't heard before. So perhaps I can go to Francisco first. Any kind of quick reflections and key headline messages that you took away from the presentations?
Thank you, Janine. Well, here in IRENA, we have been looking to patent data for quite a while, and looking at the questions we have seen in the chat. No, I think that some of the questions are also shared by us, especially when we start to use patent data. And maybe quickly, my 4 main frustrations with patent data at the beginning was the issue about not having the data for the last 3 years, because patent offices take long to record these years. The second one is that each country has a different approach to patent files. So one is, for example, they patent a whole wind turbine, while others have a patent for each screw in the wind turbine. So not one patent, but they have 1,000 patents for the same invention. The third one is the classification of patent data, how refined they are. No, some they have big classifications, other very refined classification. And the fourth one is the licensing. So the other half of the coin. So we know patents, but patents should be used by someone through licenses, and we don't have that information. No, but having said that, what is also true is that despite that, patent data is transparent because it's publicly available, it's free, and it also is clearly a good indication of invention activity. So despite these downsides or let's say limitations, patent data continue to be one, in my view, one of the best indicators we have related to innovation because we have a lot of data freely available, transparent, that we can question whatever, but we can do it, and I think it's available for everyone. So I still think that patent data is extremely valuable for all of us as policymakers and international organizations.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Yeah, Nick, perhaps I can turn to you. Do you share similar reflections, similar thoughts on the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the use of patent data?
Yeah, I share some of the concerns, and I think this is one of the few conferences where symposia I've been involved in where the first set of questions were not sort of negative with respect to the use of patent data. It's frequently the arguments you get, but I think that's because all of us are familiar with the use of patent data and all the shortcomings, and David drew some of those out. Well, a thing that occurs to me that I think is fundamentally important, and that's what we see at the IEA, is that energy markets and technologies are changing fundamentally. They're going through a huge transition. And I think we need to assess what that means for, let's call it, propensities to patent. You know, it's not just a function of the nature of the technologies, but the nature of the technologies are more or less patentable than was the case previously, but also the nature of the firms that are doing the innovation. Do they have characteristics which are more or less likely to patent? And we have to bear that in mind because we have to think as we're trying to compare, even within the time series, whether or not the time series that we're looking at are being affected by these changing propensity to patent, which reflects the changing nature of the markets, the energy markets. So that's one point that I'd like to make. The other point I'd like to make is that I sometimes feel that patent data on its own are not very useful. And this is a point I think David made, is that you have to link it with other data sets. If you don't link it with other data sets, it's very difficult to say something that is of value to policymakers, whether it be from the science to technology, patent step, or from the patent to product, market penetration step. And all of that requires linking it to other sets of data and is inevitably a very complicated process. So for me, the big question going forward is how to make those links in a rigorous and robust manner, and it's in that way that we can draw out the value of the patent data.
Thanks very much. I think that's really interesting. And I think here I'll bring in Mangalis to kind of comment and perhaps kind of take this a bit further, sort of getting those different views from across people who are really sort of looking at this in depth. Yeah, any other thoughts on you know some of these reflections that have been made already by IEA and Irina there, and I guess that kind of comment there around how do we improve this in the future? What's the approach to kind of really strengthen this and the evidence that we can get in the future?
Jenny, I don't know if you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Look, my first reaction in listening to the presentations is, let's say, an obvious observation that I hope that I share it with all of the audience here today, is that there has been a convergence. There has been a convergence on the results, which at the end of the day may not be surprising, given that all of us start from the same data set and pretty much we're using the same methodology. And we are all here today because we see value in this indicator of patents, because it is useful also to my view to be able to gauge the effectiveness of our prior programs, or also for the industry also to gauge themselves where they are, instead of, in the case of research and innovation, of course, in the case that they decide also to patent rather than using other instruments to protect their own inventions. However, I would also fully much agree with the presentation of Professor Pop that I really enjoyed, because I would like to see the problem from a policy point of view. I have all this historical data. So the question to me is, and to my colleagues, how can I use this to improve my current policies, and how I can design new and more efficient research and innovation policies? Are the patent data a useful tool? I don't want to, and I think that this is going to be a very interesting discussion. My view on this is that it is one indicator of many, that we'll have to see it as a part of a basket, because alone, and I don't think that this provides the full picture to allow us, to design a way forward. And another question that I have, it's an open question, not to be answered today by the presenters, but something that we need to reflect on is, what would trigger, for example, an increase in patent activity? Professor Pop had in his slides some triggering points like R&D policy. We are also working on R&D policy, but the slides of the colleagues, of all of them, instead of putting as triggering points advances in R&I policy, they used the financial troubles in 2007. So is it therefore external, let's say, financial and other environmental in the overall ecosystem that sets research and innovation critical for innovation, or it is only our research and innovation policies? And then concluding here, so I can leave space also for the other colleagues, following the COVID-19 pandemic, we have huge stimulus packages around the world. The question, therefore, is, will these stimulus packages trigger some activity that is going to bring in more inventions? And how, and if we're going to observe this a few years down the road, how can we use patents again to be able to help us design better policies or better instruments in general, whether these are financial, research or innovation, or in our case, energy specific? And when we're discussing about mission innovation, how we can design actions in mission innovation that will have high chances of success that are going to trigger increased invention activity among the member states and the industries that they are hosting. But I think that these are open questions that we will have the time to debate in this event and other events to come.
I think those are really interesting comments and questions, and I hope we can delve into those a little bit more. On that question of policies and what do policymakers, what information do they need, what is helpful in this space? Sangeeta, can I ask you to reflect on that sort of question? Are you using patent information at all at the moment in the Indian government, or what type of information would you be looking for that would be helpful as you're thinking about what policies you implement or what programs you implement?
Yes, thank you, Jenny. First of all, Jenny, you and Daniele for this opportunity. It's all the speakers, they have very nicely addressed and emphasized on the need for the innovation and landscaping of clean energy patents. It is definitely important for two aspects. One is this data of use of metrics can be used for predictive tools, as a predictive tool for innovation decision making. It's definitely useful for policy making. So it's both way. Either you can come on the policies top-down approach, or from the innovations, then you come back to this trend. You get to know the trend. And second aspect is very important is how this data, whether they're able to get the data and how this data is useful, how this patenting are adding value to the ecosystem, both at local as well as global level. So that's very important. So that those measures are very important in this aspect. in the specifically in clean energy aspects, because there are a lot of innovations happening, many patents are there, but how they are translated to actual products or processes in the field level. And with context to the mission innovation, as many countries are working on different innovations and patent, but however they are may not be applicable in those countries. So those should be open for other countries, and that can be utilized under the cooperation. So instead of tech transfer, if we say that it is like a innovation cooperation, so for adaptability, both countries can jointly work together and all these innovations can be translated very fast. So we can have accelerated translation. So this is what my point, and definitely India has been supporting. There are many publications, but a lot of awareness is created to patent for making the patent and IP protection and all. But these are just quick reflections on that point. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta. And turning to David now. So I think there's a few things that have come out here as sort of critical considerations for the future. So the interaction of patent data with other indicators to get more evidence and learning, and also this sort of, that kind of question that we had around, what information can we take away from the analysis of patents to really understand the types of policies and activities that trigger patent activity. I mean, do you think those are both sort of important questions, or other things that you'd add to that, David, or would you like to comment on those two topics?
Well, I think certainly kind of, thinking about the information we take away, and I think, we can think of a couple things here. So there was a comment before about, what can we learn from them, and thinking about, policy and so on. And I think, one thing is that, it's, patents are probably, it's not so much they're useful as a real-time indicator. I know we've already talked, there are some legs when they're reported and stuff, but it's an opportunity to look at it in much more detail than other types of inventive data on what works and what doesn't work. And so we can learn from the past to use that as guidance for designing policy. One thing that hasn't come up, and I think, this kind of goes back to linking patents to outcome, is we've seen several times the graph of this peak around the financial crisis. And, I think people use the financial crisis as saying that's when it happened because that's what happened at that time. But there's, we have no evidence that it's actually the financial crisis itself that caused a decrease in patenting. But the other thing goes back to why we care, because it's not even obvious to me that the decline in patenting is a problem. So I'm going to be a bit provocative in that. I mean, so one thing that was encouraging to see in the latest data is that we're starting to see the enabling technologies are starting to see increased innovation in those again. In the paper that the data that I showed you came from, that was before that recent upturn. And so that was a concern that we weren't seeing, continuing innovation on enabling technologies, as we know we haven't solved the problems of energy storage or grid management yet. The cost of solar energy has fallen, by a factor of 7 over the last decade. I mean, innovation may be falling simply because we got it right and we were successful, right? We don't need to just keep pumping out more patents if we've actually, reached a technology, reached a stage where the technology is working. And so keeping in mind, what the ultimate goal is and why we care, and not just looking at patents for the sake of patents, I think is really important.
Fantastic. That's, I think, really interesting. Yeah, do you sort of get a sort of peak patent moment as things are sort of emerging, and then does it decline? And I think we've also, there's some more evidence emerging around the types of policies as well that are important at different stages of the innovation cycle, and demand pull versus supply push. So it's all part of an interesting conversation. And then Francesco, Nick, I mean, would you like to comment on some of those questions that came up either around this? How do we link some of the indicators to get kind of better information to make more use of this, or what do we know about, based on the sort of what we're seeing in terms of the evidence around patenting, like what can we take from that in terms of information for policymakers about what works or what doesn't work? Would either of you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do so, Jenny, if I might. First of all, I agree with what David was saying at the very end, and I have to say, when we started to see the decline in 2012, David and I had talks. I spoke with Jan about it as well, and talked to my colleagues at the OECD. and said, you know, is this real? Or is this a measurement error problem? What's going on here? And now that we have more granular data and more recent data, and we've seen that some areas are taking off while others are stagnating, I think that makes perfect sense. And it makes perfect sense both because of the maturity of the technologies, but also because of the complementarity between the technologies. We created this huge amount of knowledge related to the generating technologies. And to a certain extent, we're not innovating on the technologies which are complementary with it in order to get it into the grid, not to develop capacity, to develop use. And so now we're catching up a little bit with respect to what took place previously. That to me is a very significant piece of information for policymakers. But it tells the importance of actually thinking about those technologies that are complementary with other technologies and for which support needs to be provided in a more or less contemporaneous manner. We've curtailed a huge amount of generating capacity because we hadn't invested significantly enough in some of the enabling technologies. And then with respect to the question about the links with policy, to me, this is fundamentally important. It's not just demand versus supply. You know, I was at the OECD Directorate for Science, Technology and Innovation. Now I'm at the International Energy Agency. The first question that countries would ask me was, should I be using direct support for R&D or should I be using tax credits? And we couldn't answer that question. We cannot answer that question. That's a fundamental question that we need to be able to address. We give stories about, well, what the balance could be and the link between sort of mission-oriented innovation and more basic innovation, those sorts of things. But I think we have to make the links between policy data and the innovation process. And if we have shortcomings, and we do have shortcomings with respect to data access, we have significant shortcomings with respect to policy data access. The process by which grants are allocated, the process by which many of these things take place. And to make the link then with the kind of studies that David is doing, which then look at R&D to patents, and subsequently to citations. So to me, the big hole is the policy side. And then, of course, the product side subsequently, but we'll probably come back to that. And there's a lot of interesting things I think that can be done as well further down the innovation cycle.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Francisco, would you like to add anything on top of that?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that also looking at patent data, and I think you mentioned it before, the interesting part also is to learn from the historical data and then try to find this causation, no? Which is extremely complicated. Professor Bob was mentioning about the economic crisis, for example, to try to understand the bump and the down. For example, we are looking also into the level of maturity and then the spillover into other technologies. And I already in my presentation mentioned about enabling technologies to integrate variable renewals. And we see that, for example, smart charging is increasing their patent filing 4 times faster than renewable generation technologies. Yeah? So we are seeing that maybe there is a shift in innovation from one sector to the other. Yeah, and the other aspect is, for example, the pool part is the carbon market, for example, which is another way to try to understand that and how the demand for these credits. I mean, the CDM, for example, have a huge impact in China, and that we see this ramp up that also I think Trinomics showed, no, on renewable energy technologies. Then again after Copenhagen, and then the Paris Agreement, and so on. And this is a multifaceted aspect, a multi-factor. So what we need is also to try to come with this meta analysis, no? What is what we are trying actually to do with the project that we have with with the UK and the European Commission. I think it would have been great if Vangelis would have joined our workshop 2 weeks ago, because he would have seen how we have 30 indicators where patent is one, and another 29 indicators trying to work together to have a good mapping on, okay, what is happening and what are the policies that have impact here and what is the outcome that we can expect. Because we usually go to the usual suspect, R&D investment, patent data, scientific publications. But there are so many other aspects that we need to look into and really to try to understand. So I think that this multifaceted and multi-criteria indicators is very important also to give insights to policymakers.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think I'm really interested by the. I think that was great. That was a great workshop. If anybody didn't go to that, I think really interesting. This sort of like how do the types of different indicators we can think about, how we can pull it together. And I'm also very interested in these comments about the sort of shift in the types of technologies that we're seeing emerging. Shifting from this kind of the sort of technologies that we've initially seen sort of progress through in innovation, so sort of solar and offshore wind, etc., and now kind of moving to these complementary solutions. Yeah, it'd be interesting. I don't know. Can anybody sort of talk a little bit about how much this patent data can be used to get a sense of some of these emerging areas and some of the interconnectivity between them. Because I think that's a really interesting point, particularly as governments are shifting towards these sort of harder to abate sectors and beginning to think about a whole of economy approach. How can it help governments to really sort of get a sense of some of these hotspots and whether how rapidly they're emerging? Anybody want to chime in on that?
I'll say a little bit. I think it's a good example of kind of thinking. Two things, kind of thinking conceptually about what the data measures, but also what Francesco just said, and talking about putting together different types of indicators. So we see two things with we're looking at kind of the smart grids enabling technology. Right? We do see that there is this a bit of an upswing, which suggests innovation is moving in that direction. The other thing that I know came out in this, in the data is that the level of activity. I mean, if you just look at patents, is relatively low relative to what we saw in wind or solar. So it could be, evidence that we're not getting enough innovation there. But this is where multiple indicators are really helpful, right? Because one thing that we should think about is whether, in the same way, it's very easy to patent a photovoltaic solar cell. You have a concrete invention, right? Where a lot of the innovation that's going on may be more it may be simply be management innovation, things that are done at the ISO to think about different ways to manage the grid. That may not be a physical concept that's easy to patent. And so this is where having multiple measures and, what do we see in terms of scientific publications? What do I see in the chat talk about using survey data? Because, if there are things going on kind of behind the scenes, but we're not seeing new products come out, patent data is not going to be the way to pick those up.
Maybe if I could add, maybe some examples on what you mentioned, the hard to abate sectors and the linkages. No, what we are seeing now with our ongoing analysis on enabling technologies is that, as mentioned, electromobility is getting a lot of attention. Interestingly, if we look at batteries for mobile applications, almost half of the patents filed for this application are coming, for example, related not only to lithium-ion batteries, but ultra supercapacitors, which a few years ago by some manufacturers was seen as one alternative to address the fast charging issue. No, so we saw that definitely there was an interest now in this sector increasing. Now we are doing analysis on e-methanol and e-ammonia for the chemical sector, and we are seeing the increase in patents also in hydrogen from electrolysis and also the production of its derivatives. And maybe the third example we have seen, which is still small but growing over time, is thermal energy storage. So from the chart I show in my slide with the enabling technologies, the yellow on the right side is thermal energy storage, and it has increased a significant fast pace in the last few years because it's seen also as an option to couple the power sector with the heating and cooling sector, particularly the solid state thermal energy storage. So we are seeing already some examples, and actually patent is helping us to have one of the evidence, just one, because there are many other types of indicators, but one of the indicators that can show some evidence on how the industry is moving towards addressing this hard to abate sector. So maybe those examples help.
Jenny, if I may also add something here.
Of course.
We all believe in the value of patents as an indicator, but we have to also understand what are the limitations, where we can use them to get some very robust results and where we can only get some very weak signals. So for me, I see here two problems. One is that sometimes when we're talking about some enabling technologies, and there we may have an innovation that the current classification does not allow us to immediately see that this is related to one of the low carbon technologies that we're addressing today. An innovation in materials or an innovation in a very generic process can be key to storage, to batteries. However, maybe our colleagues in EPO, they don't put them in the right classification, or they cannot identify the right classification. I'm sure that they're doing their best by all means. However, it will be difficult for us that we are just the recipients of the global data if we don't go to the description of every single patent to be able to identify that this is coming. And this brings me to the question, your question, Jenny, that I think that you hinted also, if we can use patents to see what is coming up. And here I see two difficulties, if I may say. One is, for example, if the patents will be able to identify these little innovations that will allow us very quickly to say, hold on, this is going to be a very big breakthrough in electromobility or the smart grid or something else. The second is that research takes some time to become a patent and the patent to become public. So therefore, although I do not question the value of patents, there are other means that we can have a better horizon scanning and foresight. Maybe in this case, scientific publications may have a shorter period from the time that the invention was made or the discovery was made until it became public, could be another indicator that can give us an earlier warning rather than the patent analysis. And to conclude here, I just want to echo what the other colleagues have said. To my view, there is no point of looking into patent numbers and then try to explain them and come up with a story by looking them in isolation. I can only share my experience with you, the experience that we have in a joint research center of the European Commission, where we support research, innovation, and competitiveness policies. We use patents, but patents for us is only one of the several indicators that we have in a broader assessment framework that puts together investments, puts together publications, trade, the cost of energy that was mentioned before, deployment figures, and many other indicators, even some non-quantitative indicators, but we develop an overall assessment framework that allows us to have a more complete picture to understand the current status and the progress of innovation and competitiveness in Europe.
That's great, thank you. And actually, can I just follow on on that? Can you say anything about how, potentially for the Green Deal in Europe, has this data been used to kind of help to identify where the EU should sort of focus its investments and efforts under the Green Deal, for instance?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jenny, for this question. What we have succeeded to do is to introduce patents analysis in a number of key outputs of the European Commission that helps developing some specific policies in the European Union and, of course, to deliver the Green Deal. For those of our audience that they do not really know us, we are the Science and the Knowledge Service of the European Commission. So we're working on patents for more than 10 years now, and we have developed a framework that we believe it's very robust, it's very transparent. Actually, we developed in the very beginning in consultation with the research arm of the European Patent Office, with the EPO Academy. And we produce every year for a decade now information about patenting activity through patent families. So inventions, as Francesco said, for clean energy technologies categorized according to the European Union policies, and in particular the Energy Union. What we do is that every year we publish our findings in two flagship reports of the European Union. One is the annual State of the Energy Union report that describes progress in the European Union energy policies. And there is a very specific chapter on research and innovation. So we use patent indicators as one of the indicators to see the evolution of the research and innovation landscape in the European Union. And there we see how patenting activity evolves within the European Union in specific sectors like renewables, electromobility, and everything is well documented. But again, here we go in line with the requirements of EU policy. So we, by and large, rely on the Y02 classification, but we do a meta classification in order to reallocate the patents according to the needs of the European Union. Another major activity that we carry out every year, actually we started last year, and this September is going to be the second year. The European Union every September publishes the annual Clean Energy Competitiveness Progress Report. It is a report where we see the status of competitiveness of the European clean energy industry. And in this analysis, we also try to benchmark the European Union with our major international partners. Now, the latter report in particular always arrives to policy recommendations on how we can boost competitiveness. So there, patents, as I mentioned to you before, is one of the handful of indicators that we have developed as an overall framework where we see how well we see the health of the European competitiveness overall ecosystem, and there we make some very concrete recommendations. But again, we put this information, we offer it to our colleagues in the policy-making Directorate General, and together with Energy and Research and Innovation, jointly we come up with some very useful conclusions. The next report will be available next October.
Thank you very much. That is extremely comprehensive, and yes, a very detailed use of this information in the European Union. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap up shortly, but I just think I'd like to ask each of the panelists in turn. I think it's been a really interesting discussion and brought up a lot of challenges, issues, areas potentially of improvement going forwards. So I'd just really like to ask for a very brief comment. What from each of you in turn, what do you think Mission Innovation should be focusing on the future in this space to strengthen the landscape, to strengthen the innovation data landscape in this area, kind of with a particular focus on patents? So Sangeeta, can I call on you first? What do you think? How do you think Mission Innovation could, for instance, really support India in this space?
Mission Innovation is a very good platform for this, and definitely this can help in the filling the gap in innovation scape. We have to get into the industries aspect. There are a lot of patents, industry engagement is very important, and how we can connect these, how these data can be used for the both for public interest. So because definitely all industries are going to be benefited from these innovations. They are going to get a lot of profit out of this. So we have to, both public sector and private sector can come together and co-develop these technologies that Mission Innovation can facilitate. The second point, it's different from what you asked the question. So, like for publications, we have H index. It's to measure the output and all those things. So similarly, we can have a commercial impact index for the patent, so that we come to know how this is effective, and with respect to the translation, these innovations, and how this is applicable for the commercial space and for a global benefit and affordability of clean energy innovations. So this is the viewpoint from my side. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Sangeeta. That's a really interesting idea. So one sentence each, very quickly. Francisco, what should Mission Innovation do in this space for the second phase?
Thank you, Jenny. I think basically what you are already doing now, you are moving also towards this enabling environment of innovation. And you have, for example, the new mission on power systems, which is not really focused on generation technology, but in integration of variable renewal. So I think that's the way to go.
Thank you, Francisco. Nick.
Apologies. One sentence, that's not easy. To me, I think it's something I mentioned before. I think that your mission innovation is doing an excellent job, and I think the focus on patents correctly interpreted, used is a good one. I think going forward, we have to think about making the links. We need to make upstream and downstream, and the links need not be perfect, but I think that we have to start thinking more about making those links between data sets, which tell us a little more that is of use to policymakers.
Thank you, Nick. David.
I'm going to second what Nick said. You know, making links between different data sets. You know, part of what that means is finding ways to standardize the data sets. The other thing that means is for governments making things public available to researchers that aren't always available. You know, to study the effect of funding, it's very helpful for us not to know just who got the funds, but who was turned down, you know, so we can compare the winners to the losers. And that data can often be much more difficult to come by. But if you really want to do a good evaluation of effectiveness, those are the types of things that academic researchers need.
Thanks a lot. That's a good point. And final words, Evangelos.
Well, I can only echo what the previous speakers have said, but then I don't want to repeat myself, but then use my one sentence for making a suggestion. Today we're gathered here at the global front runners in clean energy patent analysis. So I suggest that in the context of the mission innovation, we just join forces, share our data, our evidence, our knowledge to help the mission innovation signatories improve their national innovation systems and also collectively ensure the success of mission innovation. So we are the people here who have the data and who have developed the methodologies. Let's bring it together to the common good of mission innovation.
Fantastic. I think that's a great way to finish. So I'll leave that to all of you to sort out and hand back to Daniele.
First of all, I think the discussion was indeed quite valuable, and we will indeed continue rolling the ball with the 2 other events in May, to which you are all invited. Now, since in the agenda we have the concluding remarks from Vangelis, I wanted to ask whether you have anything to add before giving more information to presenters about our next 2 events, Vangelis?
The only thing that I would like to add is that, first of all, we had a very rich and very interesting discussion today. And we all agree that the analysis of patent data is very important for policymakers, for the design of new policies, the improvement of the current ones, and of course, the assessing the impact of our research and demonstration programs. So I think that this is key to meet the challenge that lies ahead. And we must not overlook this challenge. The challenge of decarbonization, the challenge of bringing more innovation for these clean energy technologies that are required to make these very deep cuts in greenhouse gas reductions. So, to my view, mission innovation has to play a very important role. This is the best platform to fertilize a more broad and more in-depth analysis of this patent data. So, as I said before, it is very important that not that we bring our knowledge together, but in particular, share our knowledge and information with other mission innovation signatories. So therefore, they can develop their own capabilities. So therefore, they can all find a way to improve their own research, innovation, and competitiveness ecosystems. And this way, that the overall mission innovation will be successful. We are going to help mission innovation meet the challenge. At the same time, mission innovation becomes the reference of international cooperation in clean energy innovation. So I will stop here. I would like to thank all the participants in the workshops, the presenters and the panelists for the very important contributions. And also I would like to thank our audience who have taken the time to attend the event. And I hope that we have all of us found it very, very interesting. Daniele, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Vangelis. We will continue rolling the ball with 2 other events related to tracking clean energy innovation progress in May, to which you are all invited. If you have just time to stay with us for a couple of minutes, I will provide you more information. I will share my screen. Okay, so here we go. So the first event is a workshop on working together to enhance global energy R&D data collection, organized by the International Energy Agency on Thursday, the 20th of May. By the way, all participants in today's panel will receive an invitation to both events, but just in case, here you have two functional mailboxes. And then the second one is a side event for our Mission Innovation Ministerial, tracking clean energy innovation progress, increasing the efficiency of R&D policies through data and analysis, which will try to, on one hand, sum up the activities that we have carried out over the last 3 years in the context of the tracking progress workstream of mission innovation, and also we want to gather views and ideas for the next phase of tracking progress, which will be called MI Insights. So this event is organized by the MI Secretariat in collaboration with the European Commission Joint Research Center, the IEA, and ARENA, and will take place on the 26th of May. Again, you will receive the invitation to both events. So finally, if you have questions on this panel, you can reach us through the first functional mailbox mentioned here. If you have questions related to MI in general, you have the mailbox of the Mission Innovation Secretariat. And here you have also the MI Tracking Progress webpage, and with the link to the webinar section, where we will upload the recording. So thank you for being with us today, and look forward to interacting with you in the future. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Daniele. It's a great goodbye. Bye, y'all.